Today's class is the atomic bomb and the end of World War II. The first session will be about Japan's emergence as a world power and its confrontation, really not just with the U.S., but with Western powers in general. A couple things about my class. If you have a question, do not hesitate to ask me. I will just raise your hand, and I will really try hard to repeat your question so everybody can actually hear it. And if I don't have a good answer for your question, I will make sure that I will research it over the week, and we will start the next class with that question. Because sometimes my answers are maybe incomplete or perhaps lame. So, with that said, let us get started. I think we are going to look at the way this class is run. It's a little different. It's a continuation, since I've rebuilt it, from the class I taught in fall, which was about the war in the Pacific. So I've made this class a little more of a continuation of that class, so you will have that opportunity to fill in some of the gaps that I could not do in 8 sessions. So we will have conversations, for example, about submarine warfare and strategic bombing, things that I couldn't cover. And so this class will be just a little different than it was done previously 3 years ago. And I will spend more time also in this class in regards to Japanese history prior to World War II, because I think that's incredibly important for you to understand that and how that relates to the end of the war. Now, the class is built so that we will answer certain questions. The most common thought process after World War II in regards to how the war ended and the atomic bomb was that by dropping the atomic bomb, we ended the war quickly, which saved the U.S. from invading Japan, which saved massive amounts of U.S. casualties. That is primarily how we have viewed the use of the atomic bomb for very many years. After a while, though, particularly in the 80s and early 90s, we began to see a lot more what I will refer to as revisionist history. Okay. Well, that's working.
Just make it up.
Oh, wow. Okay. Help, help. Well, don't know why. We'll find out. Anyway, revisionist history of the use of the bomb. Hopefully the next one comes up. No. Come on. Well, we need a new one.
Is it off?
No, the light's on.
Oh my gosh. 1 second.
Well, anyway. There we go. Hey, okay. So, the atomic bomb was used against Japan due to racism. In other words, we didn't like the Japanese because they were Asians, and consequently we dropped the bomb on them because we just didn't like Asians. The bomb was dropped as a demonstration to the USSR to contain communism and to prevent further communist expansion. Remember, World War II in Europe had ended by this time in May of '45, and consequently we needed to keep the Russians from doing basically what they had done in Poland in Asia. So we dropped the bomb for that reason. The other one is if we had demonstrated the power of the bomb, if we had made a test and said to Japan, hey, look, we've got this bomb, you better quit. And if we had demonstrated the bomb and shown them we would not have had to bomb a city, we could have stopped the war that way. And then they would have surrendered. And perhaps the most pervasive of all of these is the last one, which was Japan was trying to surrender, and if we would have guaranteed the position of the emperor, indeed they would have been glad to surrender, rather than what we were requesting, which was, in quotes, unconditional surrender. So those are the big items we are going to talk about in this class, and hopefully I will give you rational explanations of all of those. But let's talk about the Japanese and the position of the emperor. So, the Japanese incorporated myths and the Shinto religion to create the story of the emperor and the emperor's position. And by 1940, this became incredibly deeply rooted into Japanese thinking. Very, very much so. So they believe that the emperor is related to the gods, the kami. He's descended from the earliest known is the Kojiki. So this is previous to 711 and 712. They're not exactly sure of the exact year. The traditions in Japan were all oral. So we would know the fact of what was going on in Japan previous to that time were from oral histories for their piece there with how they had thought of the emperor and their historic piece. The Japanese claim indeed that the empire is, and a continuous dynasty, is the longest in history. So they claim there's a continuous dynasty for 2,679 years as of 2019. They will try to trace that lineage all the way back to that time frame. Also, Japan had never been conquered until 1945. And there were two major occurrences under Kublai Khan in 1274 and 1281 when he tried to launch major fleets to invade Japan. And both times those fleets were launched, they were destroyed by typhoons and giant storms. So consequently, Japan was saved from invasion, and this was viewed as divine intervention, and it was referred to as kamikaze. And kamikaze means divine wind. So these storms were considered to be a religious piece. The first emperor is Jimmu. He is again believed to be a direct descendant of the goddess Amaterasu, who is pictured there. And she is the sun goddess. So the Japanese flag is the rising sun. The Japanese flag today is a sun symbol. And she is the grandmother of Ninigi. I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but he is Jimmu's father. So the kami created the Japanese people, so they are the progenitors of mankind. Amaterasu holds a very special place in this because Amaterasu being the sun goddess, so she is frightened by her brother and she runs into a cave. Well, when she runs into the cave, there will no longer be any sunshine, and so the gods know that they need to get Amaterasu to come back out of this cave. So what they do is they lure her out with a jewel and a mirror. So she is lured out of this cave, and again, the sun shines on the earth. Her brother, in order to apologize, gives her a sword. These three items are the imperial regalia, and they are the symbols of the empire and the emperor. You cannot be emperor without the possession of these three items. They're kind of like the crown jewels of England. So, and they just recently, you may be aware that the Japanese emperor resigned. He retired, in effect, because he's becoming too old to maintain his position. And when his son is going to ascend to the throne, they actually brought two of these items out of where they're kept. Of course, you didn't actually see them. They were in a box. So nobody's actually really seen these except the emperor and his actual retainers, I guess. So these three items become incredibly important at the end of the war, as we will see. So Jimmu is portrayed as a warrior. He unifies Japan under his auspices, and he is said to have wanted to bring the world under his control, under the 8 corners of the world. We think of corners as being 4 corners, but they said 8 corners. And that is called Haiku Ichu. And in 1940, the 8 corners of the world, under the benevolent rule of the emperor, became a national policy for Japan. And another interesting thing, I think, is that it was thought in Japan at this time that no war that was under the guidance of the emperor, under control of or approved by the emperor, could be unjust. So that allowed for numerous, I don't know if we'd call them atrocities, but the Japanese would refer to it as compassionate killing. So if you resisted the emperor, you were able to be killed, and you were not, following the program, I guess. But realistically, it's kind of like, okay. So that's very, very big deal with the emperor. Now, we're going to jump 1,600 years or so ahead, and we're going to talk about the Tokugawa shogunate. The Tokugawa shogunate, and by the way, shogun means great general. So basically the Tokugawa shogunate is a military government. It ran from 1600 to 1868. And how did it come about? From the Battle of Sekigahara. Now remember, the Japanese did have trade with the West, particularly the Dutch. So consequently, they had guns, and the Tokugawas had pretty much a monopoly on this, and they used what is known as an arquebus, and they used that to great effect in this battle, and they defeat these major clans that oppose them. And they are a feudal society, so they have the lords, they have the samurai, which is kind of like the knight class of, Middle Europe. And of course, you've got the tradesman types, and of course, on the bottom of the heap, you have the peasants. So we've got that whole kind of feudal structure going on in Japan quite late into the 1800s, into the 19th century. The emperor at this time is strictly a religious figure. He is not anything to do whatsoever with the government. The best way I can describe the emperor at this time realistically would be he is kind of like the Dalai Lama, I think would be kind of how they view him, okay? He's very isolated from the people, and he's not, like a papal figure where he makes a lot of pronouncements, but he does do certain ceremonies that are not that common for the regular folks to be involved with. 3 of those defeated clans, the Mori and the Shimazu and the Chosokabe, will come back very soon to haunt the Tokugawas. The Tokugawas are very, very tough on these people. They decide to close the country. So in order to consolidate their power, the Tokugawas completely shut Japan off from the outside world. Well, not completely, but nearly take out. So Japan basically becomes what is called a closed country. The common explanation for this is a ban on Catholicism. My feelings is this isn't really 100% accurate. I don't necessarily think it was a ban on Catholicism. I think it was more an opportunity for them to gain great wealth because they controlled all imports and the economy of their country. So consequently, I really don't think it had that much to do with the Catholic Church, but it certainly gave them a good excuse. The Tokugawas disarmed Japan, banning most guns. They even destroy swords. So all power is consolidated into the Tokugawas. They have complete control of the government, they have complete control of the military, they have complete control of the economy. Japanese citizens are banned from leaving the country, and if you do return after leaving the country, you are imprisoned. Christians are persecuted quite aggressively, kind of like the, I don't know, the terrors, the Inquisition. And if you're a castaway in Japan, you're shipwrecked and you're washed up on the shore of Japan, you're happy that you're alive, and the next thing you know, you're in prison. So, hey, the Tokugawas are tough. They're not exactly friendly folk. So, let's talk about how did they close this. And this interesting thing, in today's world, the environmentalists believe that the Tokugawa shogunate and the way they ran Japan is actually a model for how the world could be contained and have a better environmental stance. I mean, so basically the Japanese, since they didn't trade and didn't have much economy with anyone else, they had to live within their own means. So the Japanese, for example, did not cut down their trees. If you wanted to cut down a tree, you had to have permission. So basically their trees stay up. So they have a continuous small supply of wood. They learned how to use things over and over and over again and to live within their means. So they are today actually looked at as being very environmentally sound. I don't really think that's what the Tokugawas had in mind, but the fact of the matter is that really is looked at a model. So there's only one trading port with the West, and that's the Dutch, and that's this thing called Dejima, or Exit Island. Well, Dejima, as you can see in this picture, is not particularly large. It's 2.2 acres. And it used to be a peninsula, and what they did was they dug across it and turned it into an island. So, if you wanted to get onto Dejima, or if you wanted to leave Dejima, you had to have a written pass. So there was totally controlled the ability to have any outside influence by that island. And again, that's the only port that allowed Chinese or Dutch to enter Japan. No other port allows that. There's 3 other ports. One is for the Ainu. They are the people that live in Sakhalin Island and near Vladivostok in Siberia and on the island of Hokkaido. So they're kind of like American Indians would be a kind of a good example for them. Then there's Korea, which has a port that allows trade with them. And of course, last but not least is the Ryukyus, where Okinawa is. And there was a trading port for those. So the entire country of Japan only has 4 entry points, and they are limited to specific groups. Well, what happens? No industrial revolution. So the Japanese have intentionally isolated themselves from the rest of the world. Now, that doesn't mean they don't know what's going on. They do know what's going on in the world. They do trade with the Dutch, very limited. They do trade with the Chinese, and so they are aware of what has gone on in China at this time. That China is indeed being controlled or being dominated by Western powers. So they're very, very aware of this. This is not a surprise to them. Well, that brings us to this guy, Commodore Perry. Now that is a fine figure of a man. I mean, by the way, if you probably learned about Commodore Perry in grade school, that's when I learned about him, and they didn't quite go into as much detail as they might have. The fact of the matter is it is believed that Commodore was quite the alcoholic and died of cirrhosis of the liver. And he was, though, on the forefront of the U.S. Navy's ability to have steam power. He was the captain of our first steamship, and he was very much technologically aware. So, Perry in 1853 is going to open up Japan to the U.S. Well, why are they going to do that? Because of coal. Steamships had very limited range. And remember, it's 1853, so we have not had the war with Spain. So we do not have Guam We do not have the Philippines. We do not have a lot of bases or little island places where we can stop and get coal. This happens in World War II, but not for coal, but for tactical air power. So tactical air power is limited. So once again, these little islands that go across the Pacific become critically important to us. Well, it's no different in 1853. We need little islands so we can recoal our ships. Well, so he steams in there, and he says hello to the Japanese, and, you know, we really like you guys, and we'd really like to stop here and get some coal, and, you know, we hope you don't mind. And the Japanese are like, well, we really don't want you around. This isn't really like anything we want to be involved with. And Perry's like, well, damn, that's just too bad. I'm just going to have to destroy you. So the Japanese don't have any way to cope with our technology, and Perry decides, well, you know, why don't we celebrate the 4th of July, and we'll fire 73 cannon at the Japanese capital, which at that time was known as Edo. It is now Tokyo. But that was a hell of a way to, you know, celebrate Independence Day. Okay, by the way, you know, so don't mind us. So the Japanese agree to the U.S. terms under duress. They don't really have much choice. And what happens next? The British, Russians, and the French demand the same thing. Okay, so the Japanese are now like, oh man, this is not good at all. Okay, we are going to end up just like China. We don't want to do that. So, this is what the Japanese thought of Perry's ships. I think this is a great picture. I frequently am going to have weird pictures like this in this presentation, just so you know. I don't want to freak anybody out. But you can see it's a paddle wheel steamer. Screw ships are not common yet at this time. It's belching smoke. It's firing a cannon that kind of looks like a laser beam, you know. And the Japanese, again, have no way to cope with this technology. They have, you know, almost no cannon. They have, you know, only sailing ships. They just cannot deal with this. So again, they capitulate. Well, we're going to have to do something. And guess what we're going to do? We're going to kick out the Tokugawas. They got to go. And the Japanese people are very, very upset with this, and they start to proclaim this line: revere the emperor, expel the barbarian. Guess who the barbarian is? All right, so the clans get together and say, Tokugawas, you got to go, and what we're going to do is we're going to put the emperor in charge of the country. And the emperor will now have control, much like the German constitution of the 1860s. So, but the emperor is 14 years old. The emperor has no political knowledge. He's basically led this isolated life. He barely speaks Japanese that other Japanese can understand. He speaks a very old and form of Japanese that's a court language. So he doesn't really have a lot going on with what's happening in this world. But now he is indeed head of state. Well, he's not really head of government, though. The clans are, not the Tokugawas. And he attends cabinet meetings because what he does is he has to approve. So if the government says, all right, we're going to have a law passed, right? And they all agree, they have to get 100% consensus, and they get together, and they have to then present it to the emperor, and the emperor has to sign off on it. Well, he goes to these meetings, he doesn't talk or do anything, he just sort of sits there and listens and signs off on everything. Now, eventually he changes. He does become much more worldly as time goes on. But early on in the history of the Japanese government, he's very, very, very minor player, I guess would be a way to put it. All right, so all the domains are abolished. Feudalism comes to an end. All the land in Japan becomes part of his empire. He is the head. And guess who gets to be all the governors? Well, the Mori, the Chosokabe, and the Shimazu. All those guys that were deposed in 1600 are now back in power as the governors of various prefectures of Japan. Big issue, though, is the samurai class is abolished. So now we have all these people that were knights, in effect, who no longer have any political power. They are unemployed, many of them. They have received a small stipend from the government, but that has actually been taken out several times and continually reduced. And so what you begin to have is a largely disenfranchised and impoverished class of military people. Not necessarily a good thing. But the emperor, to the new centralized government, declares that every man in Japan is now a samurai. So he institutes mandatory education for all. He creates a conscript army and a modern navy. So the navy is based on Britain. The army is originally based on the French. The army is then based on a German model. They begin to arm. They buy weapons from Europe. So that's becoming a very modernized country all of a sudden. I mean, going from feudalism to this in just a matter of a few years. And so there's a lot of upheaval going on. Japan's new government consolidates power, and they begin to issue things called imperial rescripts. Now these are very, very important. So you have an imperial rescript on education, you have an imperial rescript on the military. So as we were kids, I'm sure that everybody here used to go and say the Pledge of Allegiance, right? Okay. Well, in Japan, you will now go and you will say the Pledge of Allegiance to the emperor and the country. And in the military, you will do the same thing. Only in the military, you are going to pledge that you will die for the emperor and you will die for the country. And you have to repeat this every single day. Every morning you get up, you go for roll call in the military, and you line up and you all give the imperial rescript for the military. And if you make one little tiny error, your superior punches you in the face or beats you with a club. So consequently, this is driven into the Japanese military far more than anything that we can imagine in our military. So the Japanese army becomes westernized. It is a conscript army. At the age of 21, you will become a member of the military for 4 years, and then you will go into the reserves. Well, this makes the Japanese army very large very quickly. And the right to bear arms that was formerly held only by samurai has now been rescinded. So everyone basically can bear arms technically, but you cannot walk around town wearing a sword on your hip and threatening the peasants. You're not allowed to do that anymore. No more peasant threatening. Okay, so so you can't, so the Japanese samurai are just like totally like, they're out of work. They can't carry their sword. They can't beat up peasants. I mean, it's just really a very unhappy group of samurai. Well, what happens next is Seigo Takamori. And you can see that he's surrounded by guys with samurai clothing, only he's wearing a French-style uniform. There's 1 million disenfranchised samurai hanging around. And again, they're impoverished, they're not happy, things are bad for them, okay? So he decides, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make schools. Okay, we're all going to go to school. Maybe we'll learn a new trade. Well, they don't really learn a new trade. They kind of get some Chinese classical education, but they also study military tactics and weapons. Well, guess what happens next? Seigo decides to lead a rebellion against the government. Okay, so Unfortunately for these guys, the Japanese army is gotten really big because of all these peasants that now have been trained to be in the military. And the other thing is that's very interesting is it's much easier to teach somebody how to shoot a rifle than it is how to fight properly with a sword. So consequently, they get their butt kicked. Saigo, very unhappy, but he does the honorable thing and he commits seppuku. We don't use the term hara-kiri in my class. Hara-kiri means belly slitting. I find that to be a pejorative. We will use the term seppuku, which means ritual suicide. And the Japanese people are so impressed with Saigo's willingness to take responsibility and to be, you know, willing to die for his principles that he becomes sort of like a folk hero. And eventually, the emperor decides to pardon him. Now, he is pardoned, but he is not enshrined at Yasukuni. Yasukuni is sort of a religious version of Arlington National Cemetery. And we'll talk more about Yasukuni in another class. But what this does is the emperor starts to condone acts of disobedience. And this will get completely out of control in Japan in 1930s. So the fact that you are of principle, that your principle is more important than the law, this causes major issues in the Japanese government down the road. It helps to overthrow any sort of democratic government, and we will see as this class goes along that this is probably a pretty bad precedent to have set. Well, Japan's got this new army, they got a new navy, everything's going along really cool, and we're pumped up. And you know what? We need to demonstrate Hakko Ichiyu. So we need to get the 8 corners of the world under the benevolent control of the emperor. And in order to do that, we're going to help our good friends the Koreans, our good buddies. We're going to help them out, and we're going to help them get rid of the Chinese control of Korea. And what better group to do that than the Yamato people? I mean, after all, we're the progenitors of the planet. We have a natural right to do these kinds of things. So they get into a war with China. Now the West totally believes that the Chinese are going to kick the Japanese butt. They don't think the Japanese have a prayer on this one because China has also been sort of rebuilding their military. Well, if any of you have been to Beijing and you've been to the Summer Palace, you would note that the emperor's mother spent a significant amount of that portion of cash to build things like a lake with a stone paddle wheel steamer in it and to enjoy mock naval battles in the middle of a lake by the Summer Palace. This was probably not the best use of funds. Probably you would have been better off building some capital ships, but they don't do that. So they mishandle their funds, they mishandle their government, and what happens? They get their butt kicked. The Japanese kick them out of Korea, they take the Liaodong Peninsula, they take part of the Shandong province, they take Taiwan, which is at this time known as Formosa, and they basically just beat the hell out of the Chinese. So the Chinese are defeated and they have a treaty. And the treaty is called Shimonoseki, and that's in 1895. And number 1 article is China recognizes definitively the full and complete independence and autonomy of Korea. Good luck, Korea. Articles 2 and 3, China cedes to Japan in perpetuity and full sovereignty of the Pescadores, Formosa, and the eastern portion of the Bay of Liaodong Peninsula. Well, if you see here, if Japan holds this and Japan holds that, you can't get to Beijing very easily without going by Japan, can you? So, everything's going ducky so far for the Japanese, okay? So they appear to have achieved all their goals, and unfortunately for the Korean government, by 1910, the Japanese government decides that, well, you know, we don't really need a Korean government anymore. We'll be glad to take care of this for you. And consequently, Japan makes Korea into a client state. That's a polite term. And they've got a foothold in Manchuria, they are on the Asian mainland, they've got access to natural resources, because remember, a great power in their thinking, and in many people's thinking, is that a great power cannot do without natural resources. So if you don't have natural resources, you cannot be a great power. Not so sure that wasn't disproved in the 80s when Japan became a great power without any natural resources, but regardless, at this time, that's what they think. And this is very different from the German thought process on this, and we'll talk more about this too. But the Germans would think about Lebensraum, but they would also make it where you had to basically get rid of the people that were there. The Japanese never really had it to that level. It was more of a Confucian thinking that the Japanese were the father of Asian nations, and the children must obey the father, of course. But regardless, they never really looked at it like they needed to exterminate other Asian nations. So a little different, but it looks the same to our eyes frequently when we get into Japanese atrocities. All right, so there's the Liaodong Peninsula. But what happens, the Japanese, everything's going so well, and you know, next thing you know, you get the triple intervention. You get Germany, Russia, and France. They come in and say, you know what, you guys are out of control. You can't do this. So guess what? If you don't give this back to Japan or to China, we're going to start a war with you. Well, the Japanese can't possibly face three major Western powers, and they are forced to give back much of their gains. Japan appeals to the U.S. and Britain, and they basically go, we don't want to get involved. You know, this is, you know, it's kind of a long way away. You know, so consequently, the Japanese are very, very unhappy, and they lose pretty much all their gains. Then what does Russia do? Well, Russia goes to Japan, goes to China, and says, hey, you know what? We really like that Liaodong Peninsula. It's a really cool place. You know, it'd be kind of, we'd like to build a base there, maybe some hotels, you know. And they lease, theoretically, the Liaodong Peninsula from China. Well, now, of course, if you look at your geography, Japan is now isolated more, and Russia is beginning to encroach all the way around Korea. And Germany and France and Britain also take major concessions. You know, the Chinese, you know, we did you such a big favor that, you know what we'd like right now is we think you need to give us a little something back. Because, you know, we got the Liaodong Peninsula back for you, didn't we? You know, we were good. So they basically take major, major concessions from China, even more than has been done before. And many historians believe, consequently, that that aspect of this event created Japan, or it increased the demand for Japan to have more imperial aspirations. So consequently, if the West can get away with this stuff, why can't we get away with it? So there's two factors here. They want even more to be an imperial power, and number two, they're really, really mad at Western Europe and us and Britain for not letting them keep their perhaps ill-gotten gains. So with that, why don't we take a little break? I would like that to be relatively short because I got a lot of slides left. So, all right, thanks.